Hello students, welcome to another lecture of Structure of Atom. In the previous lecture, we had studied about Dalton's atomic theory and the discovery of electrons. Next, we will study about discovery of protons and neutrons and some newer atomic models which were discovered after Dalton's atomic theory. Before proceeding to the next concepts, let's have a quick revise about the last topics. So, in the last lectures, we had discussed about Dalton's atomic theory. What did it state? It stated that atom is a smallest and indivisible part of every matter. That is, if we break up any matter, we get atoms, which cannot be breakable into further smaller parts. That was Dalton's atomic theory. But it had many limitations. Like Dalton didn't explain the existence of subatomic particles. When later on the electrons, protons and neutrons were discovered, it was seen that atoms are divisible and atoms contain numerous subatomic particles, which Dalton's theory didn't explain. He said that same elements have atoms of same mass and size and different elements have atoms of different mass and size. But how do these differences occur? He didn't explain it. If atoms are indivisible, then all atoms of all elements should be same. These differences lies in the subatomic particles and their behaviors. Dalton's atomic theory failed to explain those things. He also didn't explain about the existence of isotopes where same elements have different mass and isobars where atoms of different elements have same mass. Also, there was no explanation for the allotropes where same elements constituted different types of compounds of different physical and chemical properties. Also, according to Dalton's theory, the atoms combined and separated in simple ratios to form compounds. That was also not true for numerous compounds. So, later on, there was an experiment carried out by different scientists, mostly J.J. Thomson, that is called cathode ray experiment, where electrons were discovered. So, let's see what was cathode ray experiment. So, in the cathode ray experiment, there was this tube made of glass and there were two electrodes which were connected through a battery. Now, if this is the negative terminal of the battery, the electrode connected to the negative terminal will have negative charge and we call it cathode, and the electrode connected to the positive terminal has a positive charge and we call it anode. The system was maintained at low pressure and high voltage. The pressure was controlled via vacuum and some gas was taken here. So, this gas splitted up like this. Splitting was not explained at that time. We know now that electrons are released. At that time, what happened? They saw that some negatively charged particles were released which moved towards the positive electrode, and the glass wall behind this electrode was coated with a fluorescent substance, that is zinc sulfide, and when the negatively charged particles hit the zinc sulfide wall, fluorescence was observed. With this experiment, they concluded that these particles are negatively charged, and these particles were named as cathode ray particles. So, what were cathode ray particles? Later, another term was coined, and these cathode ray particles were called electrons. So, what are electrons? Electrons are very small negatively charged particles which were observed to be attracted towards the positive electrode. Since these particles were attracted towards the positive electrode, they were considered to be negatively charged. Why? Because according to the concept of electrolysis, if two electrodes are connected through a battery and electricity passes through them and some material is placed between these electrodes, then the materials split up in two components. One is the positive component and one is the negative component. So, since we know that like charges repel each other and opposite charges attract each other, so the positive component of the material will move towards the negative electrode, that is the cathode, and the negative component will move towards the positive electrode, that is the anode. In this case, these cathode ray particles moved towards the positive electrode, that was the anode. It was perforated and these particles passed through the anode and hit on the zinc sulfide wall. So, these components were negatively charged. Later on, through another experiments, J.J. Thomson decided the charge and mass ratio of these particles, and later with Millikan's oil drop experiment, the charge and mass were found out separately. So, what happened for J.J. Thomson's experiment? What happened? It was a modified version of the cathode ray experiment only. In this case, in the cathode ray tube, there was no electric field and no magnetic field. So, the particles moved in straight line. Okay. So, Thomson just modified the particle in a way that he kept a screen and a cathode source from which the electrons were generated, and in the absence of electric or magnetic field, they striked on some point A which was in a straight line. When electric field was introduced, since the electrons were negatively charged, they deflected towards the positive electrode and hit the wall in a point B. Similarly, when a magnetic field was introduced, the deflection was in the opposite direction in C. From this experiment, the derivation of this experiment I had explained in the last lectures. From this experiment, the charge to mass ratio of the electrons were obtained, which was 1.758820 into 10 raised to the power of 11 coulomb per kg. So, this was the charge to mass ratio of the electrons. Later on, from Millikan's oil drop experiment, what happened? At that setup, For example, this is the setup and it had two chambers. There was one anode and the positive electrode is the anode and the negative electrode is the cathode. So there was one atomizer which introduced oil droplets in the form of mist into this chamber, and the anode contained a hole from which a single oil droplet came to this chamber at one point, and this chamber had X-ray and some gas like H2, and this oil drop was observed through a microscope. So what happened here? The hydrogen, as we have seen in the cathode ray experiment, splits up to give two electrons in the presence of X-ray. So now this oil drop is charged. Basically negative charge. So now it will move towards the anode, which is upwards. So the upward force acting on the oil drop is F upwards equal to EE, and the downward force is of course the gravitational force is mg. When by fine tuning, when F upwards was brought equal to F downwards, that is EE became equal to mg, then we got separate values for the charge and mass of electron. The charge of electron was found out to be 1.6 into 10 raised to minus 19 coulomb, and the mass of electron was found out to be 9.1 into 10 to the power minus 31 kg. So these were the values related to electron that was found by these experiments. Now, by a basic concept, if electron is the negative part of an atom, then there must be a positive part also. Why? Because atoms are electrically neutral. That was mentioned in Dalton's atomic theory, but Dalton's atomic theory didn't state any subatomic particles. But for a basic concept, in nature, whatever elements we see around us, they are mostly not charged. They are uncharged elements. So if there is electron in the atoms which is negatively charged, so simultaneously some positively charged particles should also coexist. Otherwise the atom will not be able to maintain its electrical neutrality. So scientists started searching about a positively charged particle. Later, after some few years, Goldstein discovered the existence of a positively charged particle and named it proton. So how was proton discovered? Goldstein had repeated the cathode ray experiment in the opposite way. In the cathode ray experiment, the electrons, negatively charged particles, moved towards the positive electrode, that is the anode. Goldstein did anode ray experiment. So let's see. Anode ray experiment. What happened here? Similar setup was formed with a glass tube and vacuum, low pressure and high voltage was mentioned, and the cathode and anode were set up with a battery. Now if this is the positive terminal of the battery, this electrode will be the positive one, that is the anode, and this one will be the negative one, that is the cathode. Now if some gas is present inside, so what will happen? Now if this is an atom, for example, it will have negative and positive both. Now it will split up in presence of electricity like this, negative and positive. We knew that this is the electron. What is this? In this experiment, what was observed? Here also the cathode was kept perforated and the wall behind the cathode was coated with zinc sulfide, and similar results were obtained. Zinc sulfide wall showed bright spot or fluorescence. So it was concluded that some positively charged particles must have resulted in this fluorescence. But at that time, what is the positively charged particle? They were not termed as proton. They were termed as anode ray particles. So what happened? The electrons were negatively charged. So they had moved towards the positive electrode and they had shown bright spot on the zinc sulfide wall which was present behind the anode. But in this case, the positively charged particles moved towards the negative electrode, that is the cathode, and when it hit on the zinc sulfide wall, same fluorescence was obtained. And these particles were named as anode ray particles. Interestingly, this experiment was repeated with various gases, etc. Hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, similar. The interesting observation was, for cathode ray experiment, all gases gave similar results, but for anode ray experiment, different gases gave different results. For example, hydrogen showed red glow on zinc sulfide, but different results for different gases. Why? This was a very interesting observation. So we will next study about the results of anode ray experiment. Thank you.